you very much. Well, I have been to beautiful Portland before, but never to speak. So it's a joy to put this onto my list of places that I have presented at. Well, this year for me is my 20-year high school reunion. And as I prepare to go back and see all my old friends from my high school days, I've been reminded of a story that one of my high school teachers told my class when I was in about 10th grade. And it's a story that has stayed with me 2 decades. And the story involved my teacher when he himself had been our age, when he was a student. And he told my class that in his class, there was one particular student who was bullied a lot. He was deemed to be the outcast, and he was made fun of. And my teacher was telling us that one day, a group of bullies went up to this kid who was deemed to be the outcast. They surrounded him so that in overpowering him, they were able to drag him out of the school's building. They then dragged him to the field, and they stripped that student naked. And they had previously laid out a net that they forced him into. And they wrapped the net around him, and they attached the net to the school's flagpole. And they began to hoist that kid up the flagpole. As this was happening, another student saw it and was outraged. So he ran towards the bullies and tried to stop them from what they were doing. But there were so many of them, they overpowered him and began to do to the second student what they had been doing to the first. And as all of that was happening, a crowd of students gathered on the field, simply watching. Within that crowd, then as a student, was my teacher. And when he told my class that story, he said to us, looking back, if I could return to that moment, if I could take the place of anyone there that day, who do you think I wish I would have been? And he answered his own question by saying, the student who stood up in defense of the victimized boy. And as I have reflected often on that story, what strikes me about it is that whenever an injustice occurs, whether it's the one I just spoke of or any in particular, whenever an injustice occurs, there's one of 4 roles to play. The role of the victim, the role of the persecutor, the role of the bystander, and the role of the defender. Our job as people of goodwill is to take on the role of the defender. And that's what that one student tried to do. And that's what all of us are called to do. But when I think about our duty to be defenders in the present day injustice of abortion, the way that one student was a defender in the presence of bullying, a very important difference is that in his case, he could attempt to remove the victim from the dangerous environment, the dangerous individuals. And what distinguishes our cause from that is we cannot remove the preborn child from an unsafe environment, from a womb in which the mother and the people around her could threaten that child. And so we have to defend in a slightly different way. The concept is still there, but what it looks like is a little different because we can't remove the child from the unsafe environment. So what I often say is what we need to do is use weapons of mass instruction. We need to use our powers of persuasion to convict the heart and mind of that woman and anyone influencing her to value that child and love that child and be defenders of that child rather than persecutors or bystanders. And so that's what I want to talk about this morning, how we can be great, excellent, phenomenal defenders of preborn children. And there are 3 things in particular I want to look at. The first thing I want us to briefly explore is how the other side thinks. What is the mindset that guides abortion advocates to justify abortion? The second thing I want to talk about this morning is how we can respond to that on an intellectual level, how we can reach the heads of people, the minds. And the third thing I want to talk about is how we can reach people's hearts. So how does the other side think? How do we respond to reach the head? And how do we respond to reach the heart? In terms of how the other side thinks, in the many debates that I have had with abortion advocates, both formally and informally, I often find myself asking the question, what do you think about abortion? And inevitably, when an abortion supporter answers that question, what I find they do is they highlight circumstances a pregnant woman finds herself in order to justify abortion. They will say, well, what I think is that if a woman's circumstances are difficult enough, then in some cases abortion is justified. And so if I ask, well, what are those circumstances? I hear the abortion supporter say things like rape or poverty or health problems. And they go through all these difficult circumstances, maybe the age of the mother, maybe that there's no support, the woman has no support, or maybe she's trying to pursue her education or her career. And they would say a pregnancy in these circumstances is so challenging and so difficult that abortion is justified. And what I want to suggest we do in these cases is we affirm that which can be affirmed. I always say, let's try to affirm that which can be affirmed. So when someone says, in the case of poverty, that justifies abortion, I'll respond by saying, I agree, to be pregnant and poor would be difficult. I can affirm that. I can acknowledge that that would be a great challenge. And then I ask a question. Imagine someone is in this circumstance and not pregnant, but rather they're parenting a born child. Would we ever say that it's ethical for someone to kill this born child because to parent this child in poverty would be difficult? And what will the abortion supporter say? No, you can't do that. So then I would ask, why then may we kill the preborn child? Because of the circumstance of poverty. And they'll often say, well, that's different. The fetus isn't a human and the born child is. And if that's the response we get, what that shows is the abortion supporter is not bloodthirsty. They don't acknowledge the child is equal to us and they like killing that which is equal to us. But what it shows us is they don't think they're equal, but rather that the preborn child is inferior. And it's our job to prove that the child is equal and is human like you or me. Or take the circumstance of being really young. What can I affirm? To be pregnant and young would be difficult. I agree. And then I ask, imagine someone is pregnant and young, but they don't think they're too young, and they don't think it's too difficult. But after birth, when they're parenting that born child, they realize it is challenging to raise a child and be really young and possibly have no support. So then I would ask, would we allow that mother or anyone to kill the born child because she feels she's too young? And the abortion supporter will say, no. So then I ask, why may we kill the preborn child? Because the mother believes she's too young. They'll say that's different. The preborn isn't a child, the infant is. So once again, the real question we need to focus on is the preborn a child like the infant? When does life begin? Who are we talking about? And really, when we direct the conversation in that direction, our job is to cast another vision for the culture. A vision that looks at the preborn child in beauty, awe, and wonder, at their dignity, at their worth. People all too often perceive the preborn child in a negative light, and our job is to cast a positive vision. And keeping that in mind, I want to take another circumstance that's often raised in the abortion debate as it relates to casting another vision, and that's the circumstance of health problems, particularly for the preborn child. Abortion supporters will say, look, if the child is going to be disabled, if the child's going to have Down syndrome, if the child is going to have some disability, what are they thinking? Negative, so therefore we need abortion. And what we need to do is not only establish that the preborn child is human, like a born child who has Down syndrome or a born child who has spina bifida, but we want to cast a vision for that child in her beauty and his wonder and his dignity. And I want to play for you a short video of someone who's helping change people's perspective when it comes to the circumstance of a poor prenatal diagnosis. So let's take a look.
Rick Guadati's life has been all about beauty and the power of images. He spent years as a fashion photographer in Milan, Paris, and with a studio in New York, always shooting what fashion editors decreed to be beauty. Then, 15 years ago, when he considered photographing a woman with a disability, he was shocked at images in medical textbooks he consulted. Where, he asked, is the humanity?
It doesn't work like this. That doesn't help. This doesn't help. This is sad.
I haven't looked at this book in 25
It's terrifying.
years.
There's other ways to present this. I've spoken to so many genetic counselors that have a family in front of them, and they say, okay, this is what your daughter's going to have. Read this. And they cover up the photograph so because it'll freak the family right out. There's got to be something else that we can do. There's got to be another way to present that information to that family. So this is Kiara. Now,
Those
Kiara,
medical pictures changed his life. Ever since then, he has devoted his talent to the disabled. People like Kiara. She has albinism, a congenital disorder that not only affects pigmentation, but vision.
This is stunning.
Oh, it's a great photograph. Yeah, I love the photograph. But they told her, no, don't be a dancer. You don't have enough vision to follow the choreography. You'll never dance in chorus. Find another dream. She said no. She's New Zealand's Celtic dance champion.
His pictures are nothing short of stunning and are being exhibited in public places around the world, aimed at changing how we see people who appear different. But he started with albinism.
Who was your first person you photographed and you thought, oh, I see something different?
Yeah. Well, it was Christine. Christine walked into the studio, and she's beautiful. She has long white hair, pale skin. But she walks in like that. No eye contact, no one-word answers. This kid was teased every single day in her life. And it was like holding up a mirror and saying, look at yourself, you're magnificent. And she saw it, and she just exploded. That's her. I mean, she's so beautiful. And she changed right in front of the lens.
She was nothing like the pictures of albinism he had found in medical textbooks.
These are the images that I saw, but I also not only saw those images, I saw like freak circus albino families, and I was like, oh, this is horrible. And then of course all the movie references.
Always his freaks.
Usually the bad guy, usually the villain, the evil albino.
He approached other women who had been born with albinism, people like Margaret Breed.
I definitely hadn't seen myself like that before. When he approached me and said, I want to photograph you, you're beautiful, definitely hadn't been in my vocabulary for thinking about myself.
I started photographing these kids and hearing their stories and these adults. So I called Life magazine and said, hey, I've got this great story.
6 weeks later, it was a major spread in Life magazine.
Well, then someone said, it's not just about people with albinism, it's about celebrating all difference. Would you come and photograph our families at our chromosome 18 conference? It was in San Antonio. And I'm thinking, what the hell is a chromosome 18 anomaly? I had no idea.
Chromosome 18 anomaly is a genetic defect that can produce a whole range of severe malformations.
Were you shocked?
It was like I got slapped in the head, punched in the stomach. It ended. I thought, what happens if we're having a baby? And we find out that this baby's born with a chromosome 18, and that's what you see.
Can you make beauty out of a trisomy 18?
Well, look, there's gorgeousness there. That's gorgeous kid. That's Pauline. That's Rebecca. These kids are superb. Ellington. These are all from the chromosome 18. Remy. She's stunning. She's amazing.
Rick is the subject of a film to be released later this year. Award-winning documentarian Joanna Rudnick followed him to a conference of families whose children have chromosome 18 anomalies.
Rick took pictures of him the way I saw him. Not the way everybody else saw him, but the way I saw him. And it was the first time I had somebody tell me how beautiful he was. He didn't tell me he was small. He didn't tell me he had fat cheeks from his steroids. And they were these most beautiful pictures of this blue-eyed little baby.
Have you seen the positive exposure presentation yet?
Yes, we have.
So last year,
Yes,
right?
last year we saw it.
Guidati's hope lies in young medical students. He's a regular on campuses around the country.
I really want to hear your opinion on this. The idea is to put the humanity, make sure that humanity is in medicine, to make sure that we see not a disease, a diagnosis, but a human being. I know we all know that there's a lot of science in medicine, but I can assure you there's a lot of art in medicine as well. That is so important. It's not what you're treating, it's who you're treating.
It's not what you're treating. It's not what you're treating, it's who you're treating. And when we think about that first point I wanted to address, how does the other side think? They're thinking about a what instead of a who. And it's our job to cast that vision about the who that is there their beauty, their dignity, their wonder, and seeing that human being in a positive light. So that brings me then to the second thing I wanted to address this morning, which is how do we reach people on an intellectual level? How do we reach the head? And then we'll talk about how to reach the heart. One general open-ended question I like to ask once I've asked someone what they think about abortion and I've learned about those circumstances and we've had some back and forth, is I like to ask a very general question, and that is this: do you believe in human rights? Now, if you were to ask a complete stranger that question, how do you think they would answer? Yes, they'll say. So then, given that we all have technology, or most of us do these days, I would grab my smartphone and I would call up an image like I'm going to have on my PowerPoint of a one-celled embryo just after fertilization. And the moment they tell me they believe in human rights, I'll bring up this image and say, okay, what about this human's rights? Now, when the person you're in this imaginary dialogue with looks at that image, what are they going to say back? That's not a human. And if they look at that image and say that's not a human, we simply ask a question. And the question we ask is this: what are her parents? Is the pregnant woman human? Is the partner human? If so, wouldn't it logically follow that the embryo of those two individuals must be human like them? Because we know that two human parents cannot produce a cat, right? It can't happen. So if we want to know what something is, we simply ask, what are the parents? And at that point in this imaginary dialogue, the person might say, well, even if technically that's human, as in the species Homo sapiens, that's not alive. So then we ask another question. Is she growing? Is that one cell growing into two? And are those two growing into 4 and 8 and 16? And if yes, then wouldn't it follow by the embryo's growth, the embryo must be living? If the embryo has human parents, wouldn't it follow that the embryo is human? And since you believe in human rights, you can say, so it's not about you as the individual believing in human rights, it's about them. Since they believe in human rights, then wouldn't it follow that this living human have the same human rights as you or me? At that point in this imaginary dialogue, they might say, well, it's just a fetus. Well, now that isn't a fetus, but then on your smartphone, you can bring up a fetus photo. So imagine that you have a fetus image. This is a first trimester 3D ultrasound image of the preborn child. And the moment someone says, well, it's just a fetus, the question I like to ask is this: what kind of fetus? And they might get a furrow in their brow, like, well, what do you mean, what kind? So then I would use my phone to get another image, and I would bring up this image, and I would ask, what's that? Well, it's a dolphin. A dolphin what, though? It's a dolphin fetus. And I would use this image to illustrate the point that other species have fetuses. Dolphins have fetuses, dogs have fetuses, and humans have fetuses. So the word fetus does not tell us what something is. Not all fetuses are to be protected. The word fetus tells us how old something is. Now, in the case of the human fetus, when that human fetus is born and is in the parent's arms or the mother's arms, let's say, what do we then refer to that fetus as? A baby. And when that baby turns 2, what do we call the baby? Toddler. When the toddler turns 13, what do we call the toddler? Teenager or impossible, either one. And then when teenager turns 21, what do we call the teenager? An adult, or even more impossible, right? So I would do with an individual what I just did with you. I would ask those very short questions in order to engage them in the conversation, have them participating, and have them verbalizing and therefore owning the concept. And then I would say, summarizing my point, you and I agree that we humans have words to refer to age ranges within our species. And so the words fetus or the words embryo are like the words baby, toddler, teenager, and adult. These words tell us how old something is. But if we want to know what something is, if we want to know the thing of a certain age and whether or not it ought to be protected, we first have to ask, what are the parents? Who is that type of thing? And so in the case of human parents, if what they've produced is offspring, then we know that that offspring is human as well. And yet what I find is abortion supporters still have a difficult time wrapping their minds around the fact that something that looks like that, and therefore doesn't look like us, can be equal to us. So we need to find a way to help their minds grasp the concept that something which is smaller and less developed and immature in comparison to you or me can nonetheless be equal in value to us. How do we do that? Well, I'm a big believer in telling stories and making analogies that help illustrate the point. And people of faith here will recognize that's what the best teacher who ever walked to this earth, Jesus, did all the time. He told parables. He told stories to communicate points to the culture. And so the little parable that I like to often tell when it comes to helping people see that this embryo is equal to us, even at the one-celled stage, is a little parable that involves an old technology that's often making a comeback at weddings. And that is Polaroid cameras. They're often placed on tables at the reception. Take photos so we have the memory of our wedding through your eyes. So I'll say to people, let's imagine that you go on vacation and decide to not use your smartphone for photographs, but you use a Polaroid camera because you realize you don't print photos anymore. So if you take a Polaroid camera, then you'll actually have printouts and you can make a photo album and look through that whenever you want. So I say to people, imagine you go on vacation with a Polaroid camera and you go to where my dad is from. Now, my dad is not from Canada, right? He's from Scotland. Okay, right? I spoke there a few months ago. It was great. So imagine, right, you go on vacation to Scotland, and while you're in Scotland, you go to a very famous part of Scotland called Loch Ness. Now, what's in Loch Ness? The monster, right? You know, my grandma, she was hard of seeing. You know, she couldn't really see her hand in front of her face, but out in the distance, yeah, she swore she saw Nessie. So let's imagine you go on vacation in Scotland, you go on a boat tour of Loch Ness, and you've brought your Polaroid camera with you. So let's imagine that a couple hours into this boat tour, as you're taking photos, you look over your shoulder, and you suddenly see Nessie. She's there. All the humps and bumps are sticking out of the water, so you point your Polaroid camera in that direction, and you snap a photo. Now, just as the little card comes out, Nessie goes underwater, never to appear again that day. Now, will you be upset she's disappeared? No, why? Because you've got a picture. Because you're holding in your hand proof that what most thought was a myth is actually real. So you know that this proof is not merely for your photo album, that this is gold. It's valuable. You're going to sell this for money to newspapers and magazines, and you're going to make a profit from this. So you're really excited, and as you shake that little card, what do you see initially? Any Polaroid camera that you use, when the card first comes out, what do you initially see on the paper? Well, not nothing. Kind of black smudges. And what do? You kind of wait or shake it if, you know, we think you need to shake, but just wait, it will be fine, but you could shake it. And then in a few moments, you'll see in its full form on the paper what you had seen in front of you. So let's, again, in this little parable, the story, imagine on this boat tour is another tourist who has never seen Polaroid cameras. They don't understand how the technology works. They excitedly grab the card from you to have a look at Nessie, but in their mind, they're just looking at black smudges. And they think the photo didn't take properly. So with great disappointment, they rip that image and toss it in the lake. Would you be upset? Okay, right, we Scottish people, we've got a wee bit of a temper. Okay, it's like Braveheart's in everyone's blood. So imagine the inner Braveheart comes out and you get really angry and you say, you just destroyed the photo. And imagine they look at you like you're from another planet and they say, yeah, it was just black smudges. What do you care so much about black smudges? Why do you care so much about them? And you'd likely reply, but it wasn't just black smudges. Everything about the image of the Loch Ness monster was captured in an instant. It just needed time to develop. And so the same can be said about who each one of us is here today. We were captured in that instant of sperm-egg fusion, that instant of fertilization. We just needed time to develop. Having said that, what usually then happens in an imaginary dialogue with an abortion supporter is they will say, even if technically the embryo is human because the parents are, even if technically the embryo is alive because the embryo is growing, even if the embryo, by being called an embryo or fetus, is merely classifying its age level, even if the biological beginning of someone's life can be established to be at fertilization, abortion is still justified. And so we could ask, well, on what basis? And what's increasingly happening in the abortion debate is the person will say, on the basis that that living human being is not a person. So then we ask the question, what is a person? And if the individual starts to describe a person as someone who can think, someone who's rational, someone who's conscious, self-aware, perhaps can feel pain, all we need to do is think about born individuals who can't think, aren't rational, can't feel pain, and ask if those human beings are persons. So for example, there are some individuals who have a rare condition called congenital insensitivity to pain, where they actually cannot feel pain. Are these individuals persons? If yes, then the ability to feel pain can't be our criteria for what a person is. And if they say, well, a person is someone who can think, what about a newborn child? You know, if I look at you and say, can I kill you? You're going to say no. If I look at a newborn child and say, can I kill you? They might coo and awe, right? They don't comprehend what's being communicated to them. Their brain is less developed. It doesn't mean because of their lower level of development that they're not a person. Or to be rational or self-aware. If you're getting your wisdom teeth out and you're under anesthetic, you're not rational or self-aware. Do you lose your personhood in those moments? And again, we know that you do not. So therefore, it follows that the preborn child, even when she can't feel pain, even if when she's not rational or conscious or self-aware, is a person by virtue of being human. And guess who says that? The United Nations. We often think of the UN as being a pro-abortion entity, and although there are efforts through the UN to push through an abortion rights agenda, their foundational documents are actually inherently pro-life. The United Nations has adopted a document in the late 1940s called the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And in this document, it says all members of the human family have the right to life. That document was adopted on the heels of the Holocaust, where some humans were deprived of what? Their personhood rights, their personhood status. And so the UN tried to address that several years later by creating a document not called the Universal Declaration of Person Rights, but the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, understanding that the term human is an objective term. It's a biological category. We can determine whether you're in or out. But the term person is not like the term human. The term person is a philosophical or legal term which has had a changing definition throughout history. During the Second World War, the term person was used to deprive Jews of that equal status to others. The term person was once used to deprive women of our personhood status, of our equal rights, of our right to vote. There was a time here in America where person was used to deprive Black people of their basic rights. So we see the changing definition of person throughout history, but the one constant is that biological category of human. And so the UN creates this document that says, if you're a member of the human family, you have the right to life. What's interesting is their language in Article 6 of that document. In Article 6 of that document, it says everyone, who's everyone? All members of the human family, as defined in their preamble, everyone has the right to recognition everywhere as a person before the law. So they're saying, if you're a member of the human family, you automatically get recognition as a person. So all we have to do is establish that preborn children are members of the human family, which I've done, and therefore Article 6 of the UN's document applies to them as much as it applies to you or me. One final point I want to make when it comes to reaching people's heads before I talk about how we reach their hearts is another argument that is making its way into the abortion debate. And this is an argument that I heard several years ago when I debated a philosophy professor. And he began the debate in front of 200 college students by saying, I'm going to acknowledge tonight, for the sake of this debate, the sake of argument, I'm going to acknowledge that the embryo or fetus of human parents is human like you or me, is a person like you or me, has the same moral status that you or I have. But, he said, I'm going to make the argument that abortion is justified on the grounds that no living human person has the right to use another living human person's body without their consent. And he said, let me give you a concrete example. He said, I want you to imagine that you have a child, your child is born, you love your child, you have a great relationship with your child. He said, I want you to imagine your child has a kidney disease, and your child is going to die without a new kidney. I want you to imagine that you are the only person in the world with the right body type so as to be able to donate one of your kidneys and save your child's life. He said, would it be nice of you as a parent to donate one of your kidneys to your child? Yes, he said. Would it save your child's life? Yes, he said. Would it kill you? No, he said. But should the law force a parent to give their body part, their kidney, to their child? No, he said, the law should not. And just as the law should not force a parent to give their kidney to their child, a law should not force a parent to give her uterus to her child. What do we do? Well, as a person of faith, I prayed. And I was sitting, taking notes, looking calm, cool, and collected externally, but inside I was kind of dying. And I thought, I don't know what to say to this, because I know there is no legal duty to give your born child your kidney. What do I say? And so as I began to pray, I sensed the Lord speak to me, not audibly, but very clearly. And exactly what I heard was God say, Stephanie, I made the uterus for a different purpose. And so I began to ruminate over that. What does God mean? What does that mean? Holy Spirit, come, help, help. And then I got clarity, just in time for me to get up for my remarks. And so when I got up, I said, Professor Snedden makes a very compelling argument until we ask ourselves a question. And the question we have to ask ourselves is this: what is the nature and purpose of the kidney versus the nature and purpose of the uterus? Because when we ask and answer those questions, we come to see why a parent is not legally obligated to give one, but ought to be legally obligated to give the other. I said the kidney exists in my body for my body. The uterus, I said, is very different. I said the uterus exists in my body every single month, getting ready for someone else's body. I can live without my uterus. My offspring cannot. It's unique from all my other body parts in that it exists more for the next generation than it exists for me. Unlike my kidney, which doesn't exist for the next generation, but exists for me. And therefore, the preborn child can claim a right, so to speak, to the uterus in a way cannot, born or preborn, claim a right to that particular organ. Several days later, the professor, when he taught his class, told the class, which was then reported back to me by a student, that he was up all night trying to think about a response. So I often tell that story to reinforce, first of all, the power of prayer, but secondly, the power of questions, to really get us thinking about the nature of something or its designs. Although I have talked to many who, when I've used the basic reasoning I've given you, that I've seen their minds change, there are others for whom I have a hard time getting through to. And what I've come to see over time is that for some, the problem is not the mind, but it's the heart. And so we need a different line of questioning when it comes to winning the heart than the line of questioning I've provided for when it comes to winning the mind. I want to give you an example. Several years ago, I was at a college campus. After my presentation, it was Q&A. A student got to the microphone and said, "What about rape? What about someone who hasn't consented to sex and now she's pregnant? Surely she should be allowed an abortion." My first approach was to express sympathy and acknowledge an injustice has gone on for rape victims, and that there aren't even words to describe the cruelty and brutality of that act. And what I'll often ask people after acknowledging that injustice is to say this: a question I have to ask myself is this: is it fair to give the death penalty to the innocent child? It's not even a consequence we give to the rapist. Is it really fair to give that to the child? And in some cases, when I've asked that question, the abortion supporter will pause and say, "I never thought of it that way." But this girl didn't resonate with her. She said, "Yeah, but." So I thought, okay, maybe I need to give a longer answer. So I said to her, I want you to imagine something for a moment. I thought I'll do a little parable. I said, I want you to imagine that someone has consensual sex on Monday, and then on Tuesday, when that same person is walking home from work, she's brutally raped by a stranger. So that in 1 month's time, when she finds out she's pregnant, She won't know if the father of her child, let's say, is her husband or is the rapist. So I say, let's imagine she carries on with the pregnancy, hoping it's her husband's child. And after the baby is born, they do a paternity test. And when test results come back, they reveal the child's father is not her husband. It's the rapist. So I end my little parable with a question. Would we allow anyone to kill the born child because of the father's crime? And if not, why would we allow someone to kill the preborn child because of the father's crime? And this girl looked at me and she said, yeah, but like that would never happen. So I thought, okay, well, she needs another example. I can do that. So then I said, well, actually, interestingly, it's interesting you should respond that way because I read an article in the New York Times which interviewed an abortionist who did abortions, was still in favor of abortion, and yet within this article it said Dr. Wickland, the abortionist, described her horror when she aborted the pregnancy of a woman who had been raped, only to discover after examining the removed tissue to make sure all the body parts were out so the woman didn't get an infection, only to discover after examining the removed tissue that the pregnancy was further along than she or the woman had thought. And the abortionist realized in that moment she had just aborted an embryo the woman and her husband had conceived together. Even the abortionist was horrified. After telling that real story, not a made-up one, I said, if we're horrified killing a child conceived in love, shouldn't we also be horrified killing a child conceived in violence? Because in both cases, we're killing a child. And human rights are grounded in what we are, not the circumstances under which we were conceived. And she said, yeah, but, and I thought, nothing is getting through to her. And so finally I had to say with a long line behind her, I would be happy to continue to engage you, and I promise at the end of the night, please come to me. I'll happily speak with you one-on-one. But out of respect for the other people in line, I need to engage their questions. And she understood that, so she sat down, Q&A finished. As soon as it was done, boom, she's right at the podium, wants to speak with me. And so as we're carrying on the conversation, I started to wonder, is my reason, my examples, my little parables, my questions, are none of these getting through to her because the problem isn't here? Is it possible the problem's here? And so at one point I said to her, trying to move from the head to the heart with a story, I said, I want to tell you something. I said, I have a friend who was molested as a child. I said, I'm one of about maybe 5 people that know this happened. She has never to this day disclosed this to her parents. And I said, being one of the small group of people that knew what happened to her, I'm one of the people that journeyed with her to get healing. And I said, as I journeyed with my friend to get healing, I said, I'll be honest with you, she never got pregnant because she was too young. But I said, in journeying with her, what became very clear to me is that when someone has been sexually assaulted, whether they get pregnant or not, they've been traumatized. And an abortion is not going to take that trauma away. And this look washed over her face. And then she said to me, yeah, 10 years and counting. And I just looked at her and I said, I am so sorry for your suffering. And in that moment, the whole direction of our conversation changed. I set aside my arguments, my apologetics, my logic, and I met her where she was at. How are you doing? I asked. At another point, I asked if the person who hurt her was still in her life. Did she feel safe? At another point, I asked her if she felt that she'd received adequate counseling and help, or could I help connect her to a place where she could get further help? And I watched her transform before my eyes. Not that when she left, she said, well, you've convinced me, thanks. No, she didn't say that. But I saw her go from agitated, wall up, hostile, to calm, pensive, where a bridge had been built. And as I reflected on that conversation, I'm reminded of something my friends over at the pro-life group Justice for All have said. When someone asks about rape, they're not asking if the baby is human. They're asking if the pro-lifer is human. Do we care as much for the person in front of us as we rightly care for the child in the womb? Several years ago, I read a book called Influence, The Psychology of Persuasion. And in this book, there's a very striking illustration given involving 3 buckets of water. So imagine for a moment that there is a bucket of cold water in front of me, a bucket of lukewarm water in front of me, and a bucket of hot water in front of me. Now imagine I put my right hand into the hot water, and I put my left hand into the cold water. And after about 30 seconds, I take them both out and put them in the middle bucket. The hand which came from the cold water is going to think the new bucket of water is what? Hot. The hand which came from the hot bucket of water is going to think the new bucket of water is what? Cold. Interestingly, they're both wrong. The new temperature is lukewarm, but the previous experience colors the present interpretation. And that's what we need to bear in mind as we engage the culture. There are some people for whom ignorance, simply not knowing, is not the issue. There's some people for whom denial is the issue. They don't want to know because it's too painful. And when we start to sense that our logic isn't getting through, that's where we want to step back and ask ourselves, what temperature was the bucket of water they were in before I met them? Where are they coming from? And how is that experience interpreting their receptivity or lack thereof to what I'm saying? In my work of 15 plus years in the pro-life movement on a full-time basis, I have met people who I call the walking wounded, whose stories most people have no idea about until we engage them in conversation. They feel comfortable enough to reveal that. I remember being on one college campus where a student disclosed to me she was bounced around in and out of foster care. The only family member she really had that she was close to was a cousin, and the night prior to me meeting her on campus, that cousin had committed suicide. I met another student who told me both his parents were crystal meth addicts and that he was brutally abused for the vast majority of his life. I met another student who told me that he had been sodomized. Another student who told me that his mother was brutally beaten by his father, that she at one point had to run away from him, that he himself was raised in abject poverty. And all of these individuals can build up a wall to receiving the anti-abortion message because of where they're coming from. And it's not that we change our position, but it does mean that we might change our line of questioning. And so the types of questions that I have found helpful that build a bridge, that allow us to be pro-life for the person before us as we are pro-life for the child in the womb, is to ask questions like these. I remember once dealing with a student named Noah who was very angry, very bitter towards me, interrupting me, swearing. And at one point when there was a slight pause, I very gently said to him, Noah, what does someone who thinks like you want someone who thinks like me to understand? You don't know how they're going to answer, but that could lead you down the path where that individual needs to go. Or in another case, oftentimes we hear such extreme views from abortion supporters. It's not that they even hold those extreme views, but they're smart enough to know the fact that if they don't hold the extreme position, that their inconsistency would be a little opening for us to get into to show why they should reject all abortion. So they take an extreme position. So the question I like to ask is this: where does your passion come from? Again, who knows what experience they might share? Another open-ended, heart-oriented question I like to ask is, when did you first learn about abortion, and what did you think then? Did it change? Oh, when did it change? What influenced your new position? And again, they may begin to reveal, well, I drove a friend to an abortion clinic, or my mom had an abortion. Then we realize that their affections for the loved one are tied up in their position on abortion because they believe that if I reject abortion, then I'm rejecting my mother. Or if I reject abortion, then I'm acknowledging I was wrong in driving my friend to the clinic. And those are painful realities to wrap our minds around. And that's where analogies can be helpful. When I debate on college campuses, I often say to my audience, imagine someone you love texts and drives to the point that they kill a stranger. Would you hate what they did? Yes. But would you condemn them for it? No. Do they need consequences? Yes. But our heart would likely grieve for them, knowing their whole lives they're going to be living with the guilt of having killed an innocent person by a choice that they made. And so we have compassion on those who beat themselves up for the consequences of their choices. We can dislike and hate what they do without hating them, and then bring that back to abortion. It's possible to hate what your mom did. It's possible to hate what your friend did without hating them. In fact, to have profound sympathy and empathy for them in the pain that they're now going to have to live with. There's much more that could be said about how to reach the head and how to reach the heart. And as Lois pointed out, several copies of my books are here today for sale, and I'll be signing them. And there's so much more in the book that goes into detail that time does not permit me to go into today. So just before we open it up to about 10 minutes of Q&A, I kind of want to wrap everything up, reflecting on where I began. We went through how to reach the heart, how to reach the head, beginning with how does the other side even think? But all of that really falls under this idea, right? When an injustice happens, there's victim, persecutor, bystander, and defender. And it's my job to be the defender. And so I just want to leave you with two stories which involve people who have done their job well in being defenders of preborn children. The first story I want to tell you is of my friend Kiana. Kiana, as you can see photographed here with me, is a student back in Canada. And Kiana spent a couple summers working for the ministry that I used to work for. And one of the activities that Kiana would participate in is something called Choice Chain, where she would take the concept of life chain that involves direct cultural engagement, but instead would have the word choice on the billboard she was holding and ask passersby what they think about abortion, while underneath the word choice was the picture of a victim of abortion. And to give you an example of what that looked like, this is her here with one of the signs. And without going into too much detail, because time does not permit me to go into too much detail, I'll briefly say this about abortion victim photography. It can be used well, and it can be used poorly. It's a tool. It's a tool like any tool. It's a tool like the questions I've given you. You can ask that question well. What does someone who thinks like you want someone who thinks like me to understand? Or you can look at someone with anger and say, well, what does someone who thinks like you want someone who thinks like me to understand? Same tool. Can be used well, it can be used poorly. So I think we need to look at abortion victim photography like questions, like prenatal imagery, like ultrasound imagery, like fetal models, like breast cancer statistics and studies. All of these are tools, and we need to use all of the tools well and have the wisdom and discernment to know in what context to use them. And so I would say Kiana is an illustration of knowing how to use the tool well. She was well trained. She was trained in reaching the head and the heart. She knew how to ask questions to elicit comments from people rather than yell at them or make, statements endlessly at people. And rather than even saying abortion is wrong, she just took the word positively associated with abortion and informed people of the negative reality of it. And the analogy I think that's helpful is to think of staying in a hotel. Like this, or imagine first before getting here, you go online and you look for a hotel. You know your budget, but once you have your budget, you look at images to make sure the hotel room looks nice. You look at reviews to make sure it looks clean, sounds clean, and then you get there. Now imagine when you get to your room, you discover there's bed bugs. Imagine when you get to your room, you discover there's stains on the bed, there's stains in the bathroom. Now you're horrified. What are you going to do? You're going to go to front desk and complain. You're going to say, my room is not what it looks like on your website. And number two, you're going to get online and you're going to inform others, don't stay at this hotel. The online information misrepresents the reality. There's that conviction that when we've been lied to, we want to rectify and we want to inform. So I'd say when it comes to abortion, the culture's been lied to. People perceive it as a positive thing, and we have a duty to rectify that by calling them to task and then to informing others of the facts that they're ignorant of. And so as Kiana was just silently standing with the sign, handing info to passersby, asking anyone close enough, what do you think about abortion? She happened to overhear a young couple walking past. The man said to the woman, that's what's going to happen to our child Thursday. And Kiana froze. And she thought, what do I do? So she looked to the volunteer next to her and she said, please hold my sign. And she very gently, kind of without any signs, walks up to the couple and says, excuse me, I couldn't help but overhear something you said. Is it true that you're going to have an abortion on Thursday? And the couple said yes. And so Kiana said, is there anything I can do to help you that would change your mind? And the woman began to share her story. I don't have any support, essentially live on the street, I'm a drug addict, I'm in no position to have a child. And so Kiana began to say, well, I don't deny the difficult circumstances you've been in, but I give you my promise, if you're open to it, I will help you. I will get you a place to live. I and my team of friends and worker colleagues, we will rally around you and we will help you through this pregnancy. And the girl looked at her after they talked at length and she said, okay, because your pictures are very effective. And so she did not go ahead going to that abortion clinic that week, but she did go to a doctor. She eventually got an ultrasound where she saw her baby multiple times until that baby was born. And Ava is alive today and adopted because her mother was informed of the facts. Kiana was an illustration of someone who defended well the vulnerable preborn child who was at risk of being a victim. One other example that I want to leave you with is of a physician I know whose patient wanted a sex-selective abortion at just shy of 20 weeks pregnancy. And this physician didn't jump to getting herself out of the situation or just giving a phone number where she could get it, but sat with the patient and sought to understand why the patient wanted a sex-selective abortion. And she found out something she never knew previously about this patient, which was that the patient was raised in a home in which she was brutally abused because she was a girl. And so the doctor realized upon learning this woman doesn't want to kill a girl. She wants to spare a girl the suffering she lived through. Now, she's wrong that abortion was the answer to that, but in her traumatic state, her emotional distress, that's where her mind went. And so the doctor was very compassionate, a good listener, very gentle. And the patient said that she felt the doctor was the first person she ever met who authentically cared about her. And several months later, a baby girl was born. So whether it's that doctor who lovingly, gently, and calmly listened, whether it's Kiana who did the same, both of these individuals offering help and support, or whether it's yourself or someone you know who's been in a similar situation of reaching out to others, it's my hope that you'll take everything that you've learned today. And remember, start by understanding where they're coming from. How does the other side think? And be well equipped to reach the head and well equipped to reach the heart so as to be effective defenders of preborn children. Thank you very much. Yes, so the photographer is not a physician, but yes, if you want to learn information about him, his name is Rick Guidotti, so Guidotti. You can also just search positive exposure. So his organization is called Positive Exposure. I think it's .org. And you can find a wealth of information about him and what he does on college campuses in particular.
Are the head and heart conversations different with men than they are with women?
Good question. I would say I feel spoken to more men, especially young college students that are men rather than women. And I would say the questions are often the same, but the reactions might be just a little different and reflective of the differences of the sexes. But I find that the men often, and I say this in my book, anger is a secondary emotion. When we encounter anger, we want to ask ourselves, what is that masking? The anger there's something underneath the anger. And so I've encountered a lot of angry men, and I always think, what's underneath it? And so what a lot of angry men have told me is about their moms having abortions. And one guy in particular told me that his mom had an abortion and then immediately got pregnant with him. So he knew timeline-wise, if she had never had that abortion, she never would have conceived him. And so that did a number on him psychologically, because there's the natural affection he has for his mother, and then the realization that I only exist because my sibling was slaughtered. There's no other way I would exist in this world. The one sperm to meet the one egg to make me would never have happened if that sibling hadn't been killed. And so that's why he was so angry and hostile. But I do generally ask the same questions. Where does your passion come from? Do you know anyone who's had an abortion? What has their experience been? And I find that my approach is the same, and then I feed off of how they react. Yeah, great questions. It's a constant discernment. I think one thing that can be helpful is to say, well, is it possible that I could use a non-imagery based approach and still get that reaction? So if you draw out the stats on the abortion breast cancer link, you're going to get some people shutting down right away and say, that's false and how dare you. If you do a cemetery of innocence for preborn children and have rows and rows of crosses, you're going to have people that get hostile and angry and say, how dare you. So would we ever stop revealing the abortion breast cancer link or cease the cemetery of the innocents because we get that reaction? And I would say I don't think we would. I think we'd step back and say, is the reaction of anger based in something I have done that's genuinely wrong, or based in a resistance to truth that the guilty heart is having a hard time with? And so when it comes to, let's say, the case of abortion victim photography, you could yell at people, you could be hostile towards people when using it. And in that case, I would say their shutting down is less about what you're showing and more about how you're coming across. But if you're truly just showing the facts, and in the case of Kiana, not even saying abortion was wrong, actually just saying this is what choice looks like, and the person, some, react that way, I would say that reaction is a reflection of a heart conviction that can happen with other messages. And we actually have to realize that the Holy Spirit is more likely to be able to work on a heart like that, which is hot or cold, rather than the lukewarm heart, which gets vomited out of God's mouth. And so as painful as that hostility can be, I wouldn't say we do things to provoke hostility, but that if the basic and calm presentation of truth results in hostility, we pray through those moments that the fire now in their heart works into a conversion, which I've actually seen people that came back. In fact, a young man from Oregon several years ago who was involved in the occult and was irate about seeing abortion victim photography, went through a profound conversion, had to even go through types of exorcisms, and then eventually came back to the organization where he'd seen the imagery and said, I want to apologize, I want to work with you now. So there can be a lot going on in the heart that causes someone to resist truth. So I would say, first of all, ask what kind of pain they're aware of the child will have, because a lot of times people perceive these diagnoses are going to result in pain when that isn't the case. There's also great pain management we can do if that is going to be the case. And I will be speaking in a workshop this afternoon specifically on euthanasia-assisted suicide, which would relate to questions like that. So I'll be going in more detail on that. But I would make the point that we can manage pain, and I would ask the question, shouldn't we alleviate suffering rather than eliminate the sufferer? Shouldn't we alleviate suffering rather than eliminate the sufferer? And again, I'll be going in detail in that this afternoon. I think Rick Guidotti's page will help positive exposure. There's also a great organization called I Am Viable, and it tells stories of people who live with genetic and physical difference and overcome that. So we want to cast a vision. It's a balancing act, whether it's abortion victim photography or whatever. It's a balancing act of, this is the ugly reality, and let me cast the beautiful vision, because we're naturally repulsed by ugliness, and we're naturally magnetically attracted to beauty. So our job is to present to people that which is factually ugly so they're repulsed by it, but then cast another vision of that which is true and good and beautiful so they're naturally attracted to it, to tell stories of people that live with genetic and physical difference and thrive and are beautiful.
Okay, everybody,
I think what comes to mind as I'm hearing you speak is when someone is in darkness, your light is blinding. When someone is in darkness, your light, and you have light, is blinding. And I think of if this room was pitch black dark, and I flicked on movie studio high beam lights, what would you do? You'd say, ouch, that hurts, shut it off, or you'd close your eyes. But eventually what happens when we wake up in the morning and we kind of experience that with our bathroom light? our eyes adjust, right? So there will be that initial reaction of rejection, but ultimate adjustment. And I would say that when someone says, I would have aborted that child, it's very possible what they're non-verbally saying to you is, I did abort that child. And how dare you remind me of what I did? Because your light hurts in their darkness. And so what I recommend is that we never take this hostility personally. That we pray for these people and we sit in their pain by allowing them to tell us their stories without any agenda to try to convince them of anything. And it might not work in the context of a grocery store where someone makes a comment, but if you're ever in a situation where someone says, I would abort, to ask open-ended questions like, why is that? Or what would scare you most? Or do you know anyone who's aborted in this type of situation? And what has that experience been? And just let the story be told. And what they will remember is your light and how you reacted to their darkness with gentleness and with compassion. And that will draw them out to where you are. Thank you very much.